Welcome to the second in our series of videos for vocations for the Archdiocese of Cardiff. My name is Father Nicholas Williams. I'm the Vocations Director, and during this video we'll be examining some of the aspects of priesthood which don't necessarily always get a focus. In order to do this, we will be examining the history, the philosophy and the theology of the Catholic priesthood as it relates back to Christ himself, and also the Jewish Old Testament priesthood, the sacrificing priesthood of the temple at Jerusalem. The reason why it is important to examine the philosophical underlyings of the priesthood is because this gives light to the theology and a subject called metaphysics, which is one of the most important foundational principles of philosophy. It helps us to understand our own identity. It helps us to understand what vocation actually is. It helps us to understand who is calling us in that journey of exploring vocation. Many of us will have had some encounter with priesthood, whether it's a personal connection with a parish priest or a depiction on the media. It's important to understand priesthood as more than just a functional job role, though. It's not just the administration of the parish and the sacraments. There are aspects of the priesthood which are intrinsic to the person of the priest, which is why certain things cannot be done by anybody else other than the priests. We can rightly say then that the sacramental aspects of priesthood, the offering the sacrifice of the Mass, the blessing, absolving, preaching, sanctifying, teaching and governing, all these aspects come from a configuration with Christ imposed at ordination, where the priest acts in the person of Christ the head, in a way that is different in essence and not only in degree with the baptized lay faithful. Over the centuries, the Church has developed a rich understanding of its theology of priesthood, using the teaching authority of the Church, the magisterium, to draw out from sacred scripture and tradition, the Church Fathers, clear teaching on the reality of the sacrament of holy orders. In the last century, we've had important contributions from the likes of Pope Pius XII in his document Mediator Dei from 1947, in which he gives a comprehensive and important overview of the configuration of the priest of Christ at ordination and the link with the priesthood of the Old Testament. Additionally, we have Pope St. Paul VI's document Presbyterorum Ordinis, where he expands on this theme and what it actually means in the reality of pastoral ministry. The Second Vatican Council, at the same time as Pope Paul, also provides an important teaching in how the ministerial priesthood relates to the priesthood of all the baptized. This subject area of metaphysics literally means beyond physics and is derived from the work of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. It's either a library classification or literally means going beyond physics in terms of the subject matter. But it relates to the study of being itself, and it's really the foundational aspect of all philosophy. We'll begin this section by exploring a concept called universals, which is foundational to the idea of priesthood and identity. Universals are something that we use every day without necessarily knowing it. When we come across something new or something that we recognize from before, we form an abstract concept in our mind of what something is. We start with our senses, sight, smell, touch, hearing and taste, to understand when an object presents itself, what it is, by analysing its size, its shape, its colour, the sound it makes, and various other things that uses the senses to build a bigger picture. These external attributes or accidents allow us to infer certain information about the underlying reality of existence itself. We can't see this underlying reality, of course, but we can reasonably defend our belief in its existence. Aristotle called this substance and divided it into 4 areas: matter, form, efficient cause, and final cause. Matter is what a thing is made up of, atoms and molecules at the micro level, and bricks and mortar at the macro level. Form gives form to the matter. It gives something its shape and essence, and its potential, what it can and cannot be. It is the form that makes something identifiable at the level of common human experience. The efficient cause is what we would commonly call a cause, how something got there, whether it's a manufacturing process or a natural process of evolution. And the final cause is something's purpose, what it is meant for, and, just as importantly, what it's not meant for. All of these areas are things that we can work out by reason, by analysing what we experience through our senses. Aristotle's work was built on then by St. Thomas Aquinas. Both fairly accurately came up with an understanding of how we view reality. When we see something for the first time, we start out with a blank slate in our memory. Through the inputs of the senses, using the accidents, the outward appearances of a new object, we can infer certain information about the nature of that object. We generate a mental image of what that object is and abstract or draw out information about the nature, the essence, which is the substance underlying what that object is. In other words, we come up with a concept in our mind so that the next time we come across one, we can recognise it using the information stored as the universal, which has been abstracted from its substance. If we apply this to a chicken then, if we see a chicken for the first time, we can abstract from that particular chicken an idea of what chickeness is, the concept of chickeness, at the universal abstract level. Then, when we see something else, like a car, we can identify that that car is something new. In order to recognise something, we have to then go to the universal abstract level and interrogate the passive intellect to try to ascertain from previous experience what that new object might be. When we make reference to universals in this process of identification of objects, therefore, it's important to understand that we're not inventing anything. It's a recognition of a fundamental property of the universe that things naturally fall into categories, and that these categories are not just simply a human invention. We can use the same process of identification when it comes to humans. If we come across a number of particular examples of humans, we can make a judgment based on their accidental properties as to their underlying nature. In doing so, we're not creating the concept of humanity, but recognizing a universal category that already exists in nature. If we abandon this traditional worldview, then we're left with the inevitable conclusion that there's no such thing as human nature. And this allows the possibility for human identity to be withdrawn arbitrarily from certain groups of people by those in power. And we've all seen from the lessons of history what can happen if that occurs. However, it is a problem that has been highlighted from the Middle Ages at least, that if universals do exist at the conceptual level, it isn't clear as to where these reside. Are they purely a construct of the mind, or are they somehow hardwired into the fabric of the universe or the mind of God? This inability to clearly point to a place where these universal concepts exist caused the problem of nominalism, which originated from a churchman, Roscellinus of Compiègne. It was also furthered by an important theologian called William of Ockham, who's better known for Ockham's razor, who, while he didn't go as far as Roscellinus, still doubted the existence of universals at a level outside the mind. This particular school of thought was called conceptualism. If we apply metaphysical realism to human beings, we study a subject called anthropology. This applies the basic metaphysical principles of accidents and substance to a human being, but allows us to understand ourselves at a much deeper level using the categories we discussed before: matter, form, efficient cause and final cause. The matter and form are things that we can analyse to a certain extent through science. We can see cells through the microscope, we can understand the makeup of the human body, but we can also infer certain information from the form of the body. In Aristotle's world, this is what the soul is. It is the unifying principle which provides a recognizable human being. Once the form leaves the body starts to decay. When we talk about vocations, the final cause, the purpose for human beings, is probably the most relevant. It helps us to understand why we are here, what our moral action should be, and understand how to direct our lives to human happiness. From the 17th century onwards, there was a major shift away from metaphysical realism, instigated by the likes of René Descartes in his Cartesian turn to the subject, which shifted the focus from the outside world into the subjective experience of the individual. In the 20th century, a new movement called postmodernism became established, which was itself a reaction against the philosophies that led to the atrocities of the Second World War. Postmodernism destroys the bridge between the mind and the outside world and denies the existence of any objective reality at all. All of the categories that we use to understand the world around us are merely social constructs and therefore don't contain any binding truth. Who we are, our identity, our humanity, our defining characteristics are just a matter of thinking. There is no underlying nature which determines what we are and where our happiness lies. Postmodernism leaves us completely unequipped to be able to understand the reality of the world that we live in. To accept our nature and identity as something that's given to us that we cannot change, and our happiness lies in accepting that and working with it. In fact, if postmodernism is correct, there is no such thing as humanity. We are lonely, isolated individuals who don't share a common nature or a purpose. And this certainly causes problems for a Christian when we are confronted with the incarnation, that God became man. He adopted humanity. What does this mean if there is no such thing as humanity at the universal level? If there is no such thing as humanity, then the cross had no salvific effect. The rejection of traditional metaphysics makes it impossible for us to understand that our happiness is hardwired within our nature to seek out God and live in friendship with Him. The universal qualities of the high priesthood of Christ, which individual priests participate on, contain certain realities. It is a sacrificing order, the order of Melchizedek. The priest is a sacerdos, a doer of sacred things. This is a male-only role, and because this definition is contained in the universal nature of the priesthood, this cannot change. The roles and ministry of teaching, sanctifying, governing and mediating, and as a shepherd to the flock, are also universal properties, and regardless of what particular challenges new generations of priests face, this is still an unchanging reality. A priest is ordained by a bishop in apostolic succession, himself ordained by somebody who is ordained by somebody going back to the apostles themselves. Because this is a metaphysical change, it is something that is inherited through ordination and an unbroken line back to the 1st century and Christ himself. A validly ordained bishop alone can consecrate other bishops. Therefore, this reality continues throughout the centuries, from when the first priests, the apostles themselves, were ordained at the Last Supper. From the 1st century through to the modern church, the priesthood is the same. It contains the same essential elements.